Good evening, all. Good afternoon for the Europeans. Many thanks to the organizers, to Professor Juan, to Kinchi, to Jad, Lai, all the team of Lingnan University and the Global University. Of course, thank you for the speeches of the participants of this panel, Galip, Dimitris, and Sonja. I will focus my speech partly on France, my country, but linking it to Europe, to the rest of Europe, and try to divide it in three parts. The first one, what has been, let's say, the most striking alternative, political alternative attempt since the beginning of the neoliberal era. That's it, around 40 years ago. How far has it gone? And what were the results, the consequences? And this experiment is the so-called socialist French experiment in the beginning of the 80s. Second point, what is the situation today? I mean, just immediately before the pandemic and during the pandemic, and also just after, or we are still in the pandemic, but let's say the perspective after the pandemic, if there is an after. And third point, what is the relationship between this interpretation and Europe, the European Union, and more specifically the euro? So first, the most striking alternative of the last 40 years has been the so-called socialist experiment in France from 1981 to 1986. And it ended in failure, in catastrophe. And worse, it left scars, not because of socialism, for sure, but precisely because it was not socialism. It had nothing to do with socialism. So in this context, France presents a singularity. It is a country where it is the social democracy via the Socialist Party, or the so-called Socialist Party, the French Socialist Party, which played the key role in the social war launched by capital against the popular classes. So I consider that if France is currently in a sorry situation, in a lamentable state, especially its progressive or leftist forces, it is because 40 years ago there, the introduction of neoliberalism was the work not of the classical or hard right wing, but the work of the so-called socialists with François Mitterrand in 81. That is to say that there was Ronald Reagan in the United States to introduce neoliberalism. There was Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom to impose the law of the financial markets in Britain. And this on all spheres of the economy, all spheres of the society. Nothing like this in France. In France, at the beginning of the 80s, the private capitalists remained completely archaic, overtaken by events, unable to, let's say, modernize capitalism. And it is then the capitalist state led by a socialist party, a so-called socialist party, that has introduced, implement neoliberalism, called not neoliberalism, but reformism, for sure, reforms. So François Mitterrand's election in May 1981 to the presidency of the Republic, of the French Republic, raised many hopes, but these hopes were soon dashed. I'll limit myself to saying that this left was content to manage the crisis of capitalism without proposing a break. The government has initiated a stimulus of the economy, but the scale of nationalizations, especially in the banking sector, was much more limited than expected. Okay, so it was a change of degree and not a change of nature. The nationalization were decided to recapitalize companies and not to change the system, not even to try to change the system. For sure, there were many positive aspects of the so-called new economic policy. More employment, less working hours, a lower retirement age, increases in wages, so in the consumption of the popular classes and so on. But the experiment turned out very badly. And the official reason was external constraint. But in fact, that is to say, the chain between additional public spending and budget deficit and state and public debt and depreciation of the currency and so on, with 3 devaluations of the French franc at that time, and the decision of the government not to leave the European monetary system, okay? They decided to stay inside. So the structure of the French capitalism were not touched at all. And in fact, these external constraints justified all betrayals. So the turning point came in June 82, just after the meeting between President Mitterrand with President Ronald Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher at the summit of Versailles. Okay, 1 week after, a new devaluation of the French franc was decided, and accompanied by a freeze of wages and a freeze of prices. So that was the turning point in mid 82. That is to say, just 1 year after the beginning of the, let's say, leftist alternative in France. Thus, at that time, as early as that time, the stimulus of the economy was over. The austerity began with domestic demand broken, with finally the fact that the socialists were doing exactly what the right dreamed of, but was unable to implement in power. That is to say, to freeze wages, to restore profits, to stem inflation. And we were entering from that time the neoliberal era in France with rising profits and falling growth. So we have to understand that in my country, the engine of the boom in financial markets was the state, a very interventionist state, plus a Jacobinist, or I don't know if you know this expression, a very strong French state led by leaders who claim to be socialists. Okay? This is the reality of the beginning of the financial markets in France, the boom of the takeoff of the financial market in France, thanks to this kind of left. Okay? So, and the turn to the right of such socialists are then further in 84 with Fabius as prime minister and with a model rising unemployment and inequalities. Like in very rare exception in France in the history of the 20th century in France. It was very, very hard for the popular classes. And from 1988 on, this project was pursued by other so-called socialist governments, such as LOKAR or Jospin or others, okay? Sometime, including members of the Communist Party, the French Communist Party, okay? You can imagine the disaster for the popular classes. So it is this new right, I mean, the French Socialist Party, which accepted the anti-social, the anti-democratic orientation of the European Union from the single act signed in 86, liberalizing the movements of capital, to the Maastricht Treaty in 92, providing for the euro. For sure, this socialism, this French socialism, is also associated with wages of privatization and even wars in the Middle East, following the US Army, and also in Yugoslavia, in former Yugoslavia, okay? So the social democracy exercised power, but social demands were neutralized, were repressed, were suppressed, because the left leadership of parties and unions here in France were slowing down social struggles, okay? So the social democracy has betrayed the people, but this is in fact its function, but also enslaved France to the powers of money. And that was their job during this period. The result was, in addition to individual and social suffering, the result of this was to push large fractions of the French people of the left into the nets of the far right. A far right that President François Mitterrand, who came himself from the far right, remember, had brought out of political marginality. The far right in France was completely marginal at that time, but thanks to François Mitterrand, the far right, the French far right, became important in the political debate. Consequently, the entire French left, from the communist to the true socialist, to the authentic socialist, but they are numerous still, all that has collapsed. Okay? So the far right grew on this garbage abandoned by the social democracy, cowardly. And today the situation is worse. I mean, we are clearly moving towards bad days, towards far right, towards probably a form of modern or neo-fascism. A sign of this drift is the police repression, which tend to harden because since the second half of the 80s, popular resistances have widened, have deepened in France. I wrote a book on these social struggles in France. If you, I love the cover, so I show the book. This is En lutte, that is to say, struggling or luchando. I wrote this book in order to analyze the popular struggle, the popular resistances of the French people since this period, since 1981, or rather after the 15 years of neutralization of these popular struggles, which recover only with the great strikes of 1995 against the destruction of the pension system. And these first, that was at that time the strongest strikes in France since May 68. Okay, and it took 10 years more to intensify the protest until, as Dimitris referred, until the no to the constitutionalization of neoliberalism in Europe with the 2005 referendum in France. And just after that, the young riots in the suburbs of big cities in France between 2005 and 2007. And these were two very important events which have left marks in the popular struggle in France that we find with the Yellow Vest insurrection and many other current struggles in the country. And since the second half of the 2000s, the decade 2000, the waves of protest have accelerated, amplified, spreading to all sectors of societies, from environmental activists to the homeless, from immigrants, workers to students, and so on, with two, let's say, most unifying battles, which were those carried out against the flexibilization of the labor market from 2006 to 2016, and the struggles against the destruction of the pension system with 2003, 2010, 2019 as highlights, okay? And just before the pandemic, at the beginning of December, end of November, beginning of December 2019, began in France the longest and most combative strikes since those of May 68, even more important than the Great Strike of 1995. And all that was broken by the pandemic, okay? And these strikes followed the Yellow Vest insurrection, the importance of which was unfairly belittled and disregarded. This is a very important event, and probably one of the impulsion given to the strikes, especially in the transport sector at the beginning of December 2019. So today, in such a difficult time of pandemic and of crisis, everyone is wondering when it will resume, when the struggle will resume. But everyone is also certain that these popular struggles will resume soon in France. And this is precisely why the upper bourgeoisie is increasingly supporting the far right. So it is a race against time, okay? Will the popular struggle resume before the arrival of far right in power in France? This is the question, okay? But behind all these struggles is the issue of the euro. The euro, the currency, the European currency, seems a monetary straitjacket. The single currency did not in any way derive from the will of the French people, nor indeed from that of other European nations. And as Dimitris said, the governments of the European country which have accepted it, which have adopted it, have no organized referendum with the aim of obtaining the consent of their population, because of a high probability that their outcomes of this eventual referendum would have produced unfavorable results and thus would have blocked entry into the Eurozone. It was the case in Denmark in 2000. It was also the case in Sweden just after, two countries which do not have the euro as their currency, okay? The euro is the culmination of a process of creating a single currency in the Union, right? But this project was part of a logic of integration of the continent actively supported by the United States. It accelerated when Washington tipped the international monetary system towards exchange flexibility at the beginning of the 70s. And in fact, since the origins and the Treaty of Rome in 1957, the European integration has been ill-conceived. It was designed by the big capitalists. It was designed for the biggest capitalists and built not only without its citizens, but against its citizens. So the serious problems experienced by the Eurozone from 2010 on, in the wake of the systemic crisis which started in the United States in 2008 and which led to bleed Greece bestially, and with Greece, all the other so-called pigs, to use the gracious expression of media at the orders of finance. All these problems are above all to be grasped in their connection with the very foundations of European construction. One wanted to make people believe that one could create a currency, or in this case, a single currency for the Eurozone, without a supra-regional state, without even a political Europe. And this initial mistake was to claim to be able to make converge under German leadership structurally heterogeneous economies without consolidation of the European institution at the regional level, nor social harmonization from above, I mean, moving towards progress. And finally, there was almost no solidarity between European countries. There is no common budget, or almost nothing. There is no redistribution. There is no homogenization of taxation. There is, logically, no inter-regional convergence. So the European Union is above all a space for exercising the domination of the concerns, that is to say, the German oligopolies, and to assert their interests. These concerns, these German oligopolies, defend the single currency, that is to say, the euro. But what is the euro? A new Deutschmark, simply. It is for this reason that the British have stayed out of the Eurozone. They had problem for sure with with the monetary integration in Europe, but they decided to do it in order to keep their monetary sovereignty. For sure, there is also their congenital Atlanticism, but the question of the issue of the monetary sovereignty is absolutely crucial. So the European Union constitutes a central power bloc of 27 countries, but it is a supra-state construction intended to maintain relation of imbalance between its participants. Do you understand? That is to say, this is a process intending to establish a deficit surpluses system in order to transfer wealth to Germany through the euro mechanism. The goal is not to homogenize this regional bloc. The goal is to hegemonize it. That is to say, to impose German domination over a heterogeneous space. And this space was maintained heterogeneous because of the extension of its extension to Eastern Europe. So Germany benefits from a euro which is at parity with the old Deutschmark, okay? Or even slightly undervalued. That is to say that Germany benefits from this situation, favoring its big companies, okay? But at the same time, all the other countries, with only few exceptions, I mean, Luxembourg or Austria or countries like that, or perhaps the Netherlands, they are tax havens, huh? Between parentheses, all these countries of the German, let's say the German guards are tax havens, huh? But all the other European countries of the Eurozone are penalized by a de facto monetary overvaluation. And this over-evaluation handicaps national productive systems and hinders their less competitive exports. So, as a majority of foreign trade takes place between the partners of the European Union, German trade surpluses largely correspond to deficits of the other European countries, and this weighs on their growth rate, GDP growth rate. But the decline in the European imports of German products ends up hurting Germany itself. So it's a system which is a nonsense. And we have clearly a Germany which is stuck in stagflation, sorry. No inflation, stagnation without any inflation or even a deflation, beginning of a risk of deflation, okay? So what is the situation of the other European countries? They cannot devalue on the outside because of the single currency. So they must devalue on the inside. That is to say that they squeeze wages, they suppress demand, they break public services, and so on. Do you understand? That is to say that if the devaluation is not possible outside, you have to devaluate inside. And the internal devaluations, let's call that internal devaluation, this is the neoliberal policies. Okay? So it's not only absurd, it's completely destructive. And Germany, the top of absurdity is that Germany, instead of re-injected its wealth generated by the surpluses it generates into Europe, no. Where is this saving surplus invested? In the financial market in the United States, for sure, where they are used to finance the US internal and external deficits. So this is absurd, this is destructive, this is catastrophic. This is completely catastrophic. And meanwhile, it is the pursuit of austerity in a stagnant Europe, welcoming US military bases on its territories. You have to keep in mind that there are still hundreds of US military bases in Germany today, okay? So finally, the Eurozone member states are against each other in competition, in fierce competition. They play on the relatively low labor costs. They play on regulations concerning post workers. They play on tax regimes and even tax events. In this regional competition of selfishness, the reaction of the various European states to the pandemic have confirmed the absence of intra-European solidarity. But this absence of solidarity, you can see it if you look at the very characteristics of the European Central Bank. You can see the problem right here. The European Central Bank is a unique institution of its kind, even compared to the Fed in the US or the Bank of Japan in Asia, or the Bank of England after the Brexit, okay? The European Central Bank is a very peculiar institution because it's not only independent of governments, so-called independence, but it is also an institution which prohibits states from getting into debt with it, okay? In particular, through purchases of public debt securities. And in addition, it does not authorize states to finance themselves by monetary creation, by running the money printing, okay, under the pretext of risk of induced inflation. And the European Bank, the European Central Bank even refuses to allow the European states to credit each other. There is a prohibition of credits between states in Europe. So all this framework gives the European Central Bank an exorbitant power, the power to force states to adopt neoliberal policies, that is to say, policies that it deems appropriate in accordance with the interests of finance, of high finance, okay? It has only one objective: to control inflation, not to support growth, and less to support employment, and less to support ecology, environment, okay? So for sure, the European Central Bank was recently forced to change a little bit its policy as the crisis worsened. But in the Eurozone, economic growth, the GDP growth rate is close to zero, And for many countries, even negative. So there is a big problem. There is a huge problem in Europe in this configuration. And the European aid during the pandemic, in order to prevent the bankruptcy of the world system, went to, and is still going to, transnationals, which lay off, which pollute, which accentuate the concentration of capital. So as a conclusion, I will say that we Europeans will have to get out of this trap, of this L, because this is, for the popular classes, this is the L. Thank you so much. I have finished.